Hello and welcome to In the Classroom, episode number 30. Today is November 2nd, 2018, and today I want to address the following question: how does portfolio assessment impact one's assessment and instructional practices? In the Classroom with Benjamin Stewart, making teaching and learning more transparent, is a podcast for educators, instructional designers, administrators, trainers, or anyone who is interested in topics related to curriculum, assessment, instruction, and educational technologies. The goal is to provoke new ideas, perspectives, and context around teaching, learning, and educational leadership. Before we get into it, I'd like to first thank those who have been following me in Podbean. Feel free to leave comments at benjaminlstewart.com if you wish to provide direct feedback, comments, suggestions, even questions related to any of the topics that I've discussed in the past. If you want to make suggestions regarding certain topics to be addressed in the future, feel free to leave those comments and I'd be happy to consider that. Also, if you want to be a part of the conversation, if you want to have a one-on-one conversation, we can certainly do that. The whole point of In the Classroom is to promote sharing of one's own practice, sharing of one's own learning experiences. So feel free to reach out to me if you want to be a part of the broadcast. So I want to think about this issue or this problem of teaching to the text, specifically looking at this idea of a backwash effect. Really how standardized testing or testing in general can negatively or positively influence instruction. When we look at today, we have a lot of cases where standardized tests really dictate how or what teachers do in the classroom. Maybe it's not even standardized tests that are mandated from maybe a state level or even a federal level, but even exams at the institutional level that are being imposed onto the teacher, where maybe traditional tests, quizzes, multiple choice, for example, are brought into the assessment, the primary type of evidence that one would rely on in order to make inferences about students' knowledge level, skill level, and even their level of emotional intelligence. So I want to talk about portfolio assessment as being kind of a complement to a variety of different ways that one can assess learners and look at the importance specifically about self-regulation. Students themselves move more from being dependent learners to more independent and interdependent, where they have a concern of the excess of how their classmates learn as well, what their contributions can be to their classmates, how they can help others based on what they know and what they can do. So this idea of portfolio assessment is interesting because there are a lot of decisions that we can make as a teacher in terms of how we might implement such a portfolio. And I think just for the sake of simplicity, I'll use the term portfolio to mean both e-portfolios or electronic portfolios versus a physical portfolio that might be more common in the case of those who aren't really, don't have a lot of access to technology. But either way, I think we can see some relevance and some similarities in how we design the class, how we design instruction, and again, what kind of decisions we need to make with the students or on behalf of the students in terms of how this portfolio can come to be. I think one of the first things, or one of the first decisions to make as an educator when thinking about a portfolio assessment is if this, whether or not the portfolio is going to be public versus private. And I think this is one of the first decisions one would need to make, so that the students from the beginning, depending on the resources available, depending on the maturity level, the purpose of the course, the overall context, we need to make sure that the students have access, that they're comfortable with being able to share this information, what kind of information that they're going to pass along to their ePortfolio, whether it's a creation, something that they created, or whether it's something that they found online and they had permission to redistribute, thinking in terms of a Creative Commons license and maybe even a public domain, having an understanding of those two types of ways of sharing information, so that they're not sharing something that they don't have the rights to share. But with portfolio assessment, it's going to be, I think, necessary for teachers to work with students and find a way also to make a decision about what kind of products or what kind of artifacts will be included. So in the case of writing, and I'd like to talk today within this context of academic writing, how will students produce and share the types of artifacts that they might include in their class? And from a very general standpoint, I think we can look at it in terms of either sharing a final product, right? So if we're looking in terms of writing as a process, going through all of those phases of writing, the brainstorming, maybe having some sort of schematic map or outline, first draft, initial draft, and subsequent drafts until they finally complete their final draft, thinking about only publishing to their ePortfolio that final draft. That's certainly one aspect. And there might be cases where students are instructed to upload all of their products. There might be cases where students actually have a right, or they have the option to choose which products to include in their ePortfolio. So depends on the situation, but just looking at it as a finished product aspect, a portfolio serves that purpose. And when you think about ePortfolio, for example, being accessible to the public, other decisions can be made as far as having students think about why they're sharing this particular this text. What might be the genre that they are choosing? Who's the target audience for the particular text? And what is the overall purpose? And really thinking about the whole overall situation or the context that would be most appropriate for delivering that particular type of text. Now, another set of decisions would be around those who wish to have students focus on the process, the learning process, and having the portfolio reveal that process, that learning process over time. So in this case, you might have where students are sharing maybe their initial drafts and maybe subsequent drafts up until they have their completed draft, and then complement that with some sort of reflection. In this way, students are sharing publicly. In the case of a public portfolio, they are sharing openly this learning process, and it's going to take perhaps a special type of student or a situation that allows students to feel confident enough to share and be that open in their own learning process. But this level of transparency, I think, is really important to the learner, because I think at the end of the day, the portfolio really is to benefit the student in showing what they know, what they can do, and who they are from some sort of value or maybe an ethical standpoint, where they're able to show off or demonstrate their disposition, their objectives, kind of where they would like to be, and so on. So one of the most important aspects of ePortfolio is this idea of self-regulation. And I want to share with you a few ideas about self-regulation that comes from a study from Mack and Wong, published in, let's see, I'm pulling up the article here, 2017. And if you pull this up, you can. I've got the link actually in the show notes if you want to pull it up. But on page 5, there's a figure 1, that talks about the relationship between portfolio assessment and 4 different phases of self-regulation. And I'd like to go through each one of these phases briefly and describe kind of what they talk about, and then throw in some personal anecdotes that might fall into these different phases, and also might be maybe a slight variation. So they talk about phase 1 as forethought, planning, and activation. They talk about this idea of instructional scaffolding, goal setting. So more in terms of maybe introducing a new topic In my case, I introduce each week with my writing students the idea of an essential question, right? So we spend a whole week on looking at one deep thinking through-line question that we revisit each day as we go through the writing process and thinking process, determining how students are to then organize these ideas around a central question. So the presentation of an essential question in Phase 1, I think, very much aligns with this idea of instructional scaffolding and goal setting. One other thing I'd like to add about goal setting also relates to the language. So inevitably, the first part of each week, I'll introduce maybe some key types of errors or considerations that they might they are to focus on for that week, based on prior evidence, prior work that they've completed. And so we kind of go through this cyclical process of revisiting key issues with writing, so that learners get the exposure and assistance and really time that they need to develop this skill, this procedural skill, in trying to avoid these types of errors. A very simple example would be the use of the comma. The comma is one of the most difficult punctuation marks that my learners face. So a lot of times we'll focus on the different ways of using a comma, focusing on 5 or 6 key uses, and I'll typically revisit those at the beginning of each week and then remind them throughout the week as they are answering their essential question through the development of a single paragraph. It's important to mention that within my personal context with my students this semester, we're basically just developing one paragraph and looking at how to best create a unified, coherent, and cohesive paragraph around a particular topic.
You're listening to In the Classroom with Benjamin Stewart, where each episode poses a through-line question or problem intended to generate dialogue around current issues that affect educational stakeholders who are concerned with improving learning outcomes. If you have anything to say about today's topic, send your comments and questions to www.benjaminlstewart.org.
Now, Phase 2, called monitoring, this is where students draft or create their first draft. And there's a lot of, at this point or at this stage, there's a lot of self-assessment, peer assessment, and teachers' feedback. And here you basically, in my case, I like to wait on giving too much feedback in this early stage and give them plenty of time to self-assess and peer assess. I think that even though these are lower level students, A2 typically according to the Common European Framework, that I think that we don't give oftentimes students enough credit for being able to assess themselves. I know students themselves often don't give themselves enough credit for seriously looking at a piece of text and trying to provide some sort of critique of their writing. I typically, in the early parts of the semester, will hear students say to me, well, I didn't see anything wrong. They almost dismiss the peer assessment process because they just automatically think that they're not able to provide such feedback. Maybe they haven't had many opportunities in the past to give this type of feedback, but a lot of times I will spend one-on-one discussions, individual discussions with certain students, really encouraging them to look again at the text, give them the time to do that, and even if it's something relatively simple, as far as maybe it's just, for example, making sure that the right types of fonts are being used, that the types of fonts are being used. You know, we talk a lot about text format along with the grammar aspects of language. And as students are developing their text, typically in a Google Doc, a lot of what we talk about is just, are the margins correct? Are they using an indentation, and etc. So really, this is I think a very important phase, this first or the second phase, monitoring, where they're not only monitoring themselves individually, but also monitoring the progress of their classmates. we're really trying to push students early on to be not just independent, but interdependent, where, again, they're helping and they have the confidence to help their classmate. Now, going into phase 3, they call control. We move on now to where students are drafting maybe their second, third, fourth draft, etc. But you start to see a shift from less teacher feedback from phase 2, gradually going into phase 3 with more teacher feedback, maybe less self and peer assessment at that stage. For me personally, based on my experience, this shift from phase 2 to 3 is where students are getting feedback from me, the instructor, and more of the linguistic or language aspects that maybe students at an individual or group level are not able to address themselves. So this is where I play a greater role in helping students draft that final or complete their final draft. Now, stage 4 is really divided into 2 parts. The first part being the error log that leads to a reflection. And here, this is, I think, an important piece from the beginning, having students become aware of the types of errors that they are committing. In my case, I use an error code list, so they become familiar with time what a capitalization, the code CA for capitalization, what that means. I use a code FRAG, F-R-A-G, for sentence fragments. They start to learn these different codes, and they start to see patterns in their own writing, as each student typically will have certain types of errors that become more that are really more common for each student. So I oftentimes will leave, maybe for some teachers, a lot of feedback in terms of the number of errors that I'm citing, but it's really for them not to become frustrated, but to see patterns and to become aware that certain errors are more serious than others, certain areas for them are more common than others, and that they start to gain an understanding of those differences, which are most frequent and which types of errors are more serious. The only way that I've found to do that is to provide, maybe for some, again, a lot of instances of their errors. I know there are some that say, well, maybe you mention it one time and you don't mention it again, and have them go through the rest of the text and try to detect that. And I certainly think that is a valuable approach. But I typically, since I don't give a lot of feedback in the earlier stages, for example, in phase 2, I give just as far as at an individual level, I don't give any feedback. I may give some group feedback, but I seldom will give group individual feedback until phase 3. So when I do give feedback in phase 3, I tend to give a lot. I think that it's important to talk to students, especially when maybe they're getting used to receiving this type of feedback from me, is to first not take it personally, that it's all to help them become aware of their errors, and that they really look at this as a learning experience, and maybe not even addressing certain errors at the beginning, depending on how many errors and the types of errors. But I think the idea here is just to try to work with students and come from a place that is supportive, and that they feel that they're getting the support that they need to improve their own writing. The reflection here in stage 4 is interesting as well, because I think this idea of them externalizing what they've learned, maybe taking that error log that links back to the instructional scaffolding in phase 1 and the goal setting, kind of looking at that as a cyclical process between phase 1 and phase 4, but taking this reflection and externalizing it, not just amongst themselves, not at an individual level, but actually sharing the reflection with the group, with others, so that they can kind of see how other learners are reflecting themselves and what kind of challenges and struggles maybe others are going through. I think that offers a new level or a new perspective for them to reflect. Again, this is going to depend a lot on the maturity level of the students, of course, the level, their academic level, and really just their overall disposition, the culture of that classroom as to how open or closed they're going to be at this point when they're reflecting on their own learning. Now, the second part of Phase 4 is where the students now are looking at the writing pieces that they are going to then include in the portfolio. And this is related to what I mentioned earlier about the decisions one needs to make as a teacher. What kind of products are going to be included in the portfolio? And how much of the decision-making process will students be involved with in terms of determining themselves which products are to be included? This also might mean that the syllabus itself will require making this very explicit, what kinds of writings will be included in the portfolio. It's just going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on the teacher, the institution, the learners, the culture overall, and again, what kind of artifacts will be included in either an open or a closed portfolio. So I think these 4 phases are interesting, and I like the fact that that phases 1 through 3 really become the laboratory, the quote-unquote laboratory that I think is required, especially in writing, where there's a lot of different forms of feedback and assessment that takes place, and a lot of cyclical reflection and teaching that kind of goes back and forth, if you want to think of it in terms of formative and summative assessment. But there are ways to really go and feed through these different phases as students develop their final product that will then be included in the e-portfolio. And making a decision again about the e-portfolio, is the objective to include their learning through the 3 or 4 phases, or is it just that they are to include an end product for their display of what they know and what they can do? I see a kind of a variation on this as well, where you might have students upload their final product and then maybe have some sort of reflection piece that summarizes what they went through to develop that final draft. The reflection can be either verbal or it can be written, but I think that just somehow combining the process of reflecting, again, whether it's open or closed, is very valuable, and I think is something to consider when you're looking at portfolio assessment for your own particular context. So I wanted to pose the question to you: how do you incorporate portfolio assessment in your own teaching practice? I really would like to hear some feedback about if portfolio assessment would work if you're not currently using it. If you are using it, how are you using it? What's worked for you? What's been a challenge for you? Is the portfolio itself a public portfolio? Is it private? And why? What kind of decisions you made when determining whether the portfolio should be open or closed? Is it a process type of portfolio, or is it one that only shows the final product of the students? Would really like to get your feedback and comments about your experiences. One of the main reasons that I'm sharing information in this podcast is to invite others to share. It's not because what I'm doing necessarily is the way to do it, but it's really more to encourage others to share, and finding the communities that you're comfortable with, whether it's here within this community or some other community, by reaching out to your colleagues and fellow teachers, educators, trainers, and sharing what works and what doesn't work, and having that level of confidence to say that maybe something was a challenge, but it turns into some sort of learning experience where not only you can benefit, but others can benefit as well.
Thanks for listening to In the Classroom with Benjamin Stewart. If you want to be part of the broadcast or just would like to leave feedback about the show, leave me a message at www.benjaminlstewart.org. In the Classroom, encouraging educators to think and do out loud.